could claim to be? Like, are we like the Paul McCartney and John Lennon of the Catholic world?
No.
Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, give us feedback. We do need feedback. So any way you can figure out how to do that through the Simple House website, through our Facebook page, by commenting on a YouTube video, that is appreciated. I'm Clark Massey. I'm coming from the Simple House location in Kansas City. I'm in my workshop, and I am with Laura Heeman coming from Hyattsville, Maryland.
Hey, Clark.
And Laura believes that we are the Ren and Stimpy of the Catholic podcast universe. So that's what you're in for. All right, this is our third installment of the Catholic Traditionalist Podcast, third and last, and we're going to talk about the danger of heresy. Before we start that, I had a couple thoughts from our last podcast. One was I came across this stuff that said that Thomas Aquinas was condemned in his own day, by theologians, and I think the church more officially. And obviously that's been repealed. And I think what's interesting about that is that in the context of this Traditionalist podcast is he is like the most trustworthy theologian with tradition. And even in his own day, the amount of change he was bringing about, like rehabilitating this pagan philosopher, caused people to condemn him, And I think if you go back to these podcasts, it's not like change is always good, but we as Catholics have to always be ready for that good change also, and not always be so conservative that we think the way we've always done it's always the best way to do it. I don't know if I expressed that well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's not like pushing the envelope isn't necessarily good in itself is important, right?
Right.
But there are times when it's needed,
The other thing that seems relevant is that we had Simple House Book Club this week, and there was a big discussion that broke out about the role of beauty. And this has a lot to do with liturgy because a lot of people consider the Latin Mass a more beautiful liturgical celebration, and that's important, And what was interesting about it is John Paul II said that beauty will save the world, and he said that he was quoting Dostoevsky. And so we were talking about that, and there was kind of this idea that is the way beauty saves the world, that we create a beautiful church, a beautiful liturgy, a beautiful stained glass, and we invite people into this church. And then as they're attracted to the inherent beauty of it, they then somehow break through into the theology. And I think this is wrong. It's not that this never happened. It has happened. I mean, I know some friends who are converts from the Anglican Church and who maybe were evangelical Protestant, then Anglican, and then Catholic. But they also obviously had some of the truths of Christianity before they were attracted by the beauty of the services and the liturgy. What I think's wrong about this is I think that Dostoevsky's beauty will save the world. I think his beauty is like a very horrible beauty, like an ugly beauty. It's a beauty that's like the prostitute praying. Like that's one of Dostoevsky's stories, that she's praying this beautiful prayer that's every night that's like better than all these church people's prayer.
Yeah, I think you kind of think of like heartbreaking beauty, and that's like the crucifix, the right. Crucifixion, and
But there's something we've done to the crucifixion and to the Mass. Like the most beautiful Mass there ever was is the Last Supper. Mm-hmm. And that was a horrible Mass. Like we would have been like torn the whole time we were there watching that happen. It's the supper before Jesus' death. His traitor is there taking, as part of that Mass. And the most beautiful nativity is the nativity. But that would have been absolutely horrible to view also, to see a little baby sitting in a trough,
Yeah.
To see so one time, Lauren, we knew a Jesuit, very famous Jesuit poet. And we'd been to, I knew he was a pretty great guy because I'd listened to a lot of his homilies, and his homilies were pretty deep, but they weren't that controversial, but they often would give you like a really new take on whatever the scripture readings were for that day. And I was told that I really needed to go up to him and talk to him about his most controversial views that would, make you rethink everything. Right? So I was at this Jesuit Christmas party at Georgetown in the Jesuit residence. And this is kind of the early days of Simple House, probably the first 5-6 years. And I walk in and he's there and he's really enjoying the party. He's kind of got a red nose. He's kind of an older Australian. And I go, what are these controversial views you have that will make me rethink everything? And he just very seriously said, we all think of the Virgin Mary and all these things, but the whole world would have smelled like poo and chickpeas. Like, you have to remember that. That's like, it's the nativity would have been really rough, and having the three shepherds come, the way we make them out is so beautiful. But like, these would have been like 3 guys who smelt, 3 guys who had one of the socially least desirable jobs in society. It'd be like the 3 trash collectors come and give honor to the newborn king. Yeah. And the newborn king is sitting amongst animals in a smelly, dangerous, place,
Yeah.
What's my point with that? My point is, although it's horrible, it's tremendously beautiful and moving.
Yeah.
And so the beauty that's going to save the world is not going to be the beauty of stained glass. It's not going to be because we have a crucifix that we've polished to a bright sheen. It's going to be the idea of a naked, good man on a crucifix dying that's going to save the world. The beauty of that, not the beauty of the art, in a sense,
Yeah, I hope I can share this, but we had a past volunteer who had dealt with some drug problems and alcohol abuse, etc. And I remember her saying that one of the key things in her conversion, for some reason, she was kind of just at the bottom of the bottom, and she walked into a church and sort of saw the horror of the cross, and related that with her lows in with substance abuse, and that Jesus would go there was this beautiful thing to her, but it was a horrible thing also.
I have an aside that's off topic, but I really got to say it. Okay. So the most beautiful church in Kansas City, or one of them, is called Redemptorist. It's where it's really hard to get married there because it's such a beautiful setting. And when it was built, I was reading the history, and one of the brothers who was in charge of kind of helping build this church had this amazing idea for a major crucifix up front. And that crucifix there today, everyone who's been there kind of knows this crucifix. It's in front of the altar, actually. And this brother had this great idea that what he's going to do is on all the wounds of Christ, he was going to have red glass put where all the wounds were. And then inside this very traditional crucifix, he's going to put light bulbs so they could turn it on. And it would kind of be shoot lasers out of all his, not lasers, but, glow on all the wounds of Christ. And I've been going to this church for years and years and years, and they never turn on that light on. That light is no one knows that light exists because it's so kitsch, but it's so awesome too. I totally have been part of meetings where ideas like that are discussed. And you're yes, it'll be the best. But then it's horrible, anyway.
Yeah. Also, just the contrast. I know what church you're talking about, and the contrast of that idea with everything else.
Everything's so tasteful, right? I wish in Easter liturgy, they would or Good Friday liturgy, they turn that light on,
Maybe it would be really moving, Clark.
It would be moving for me. Yes. Yeah. All right. Let's signpost what we're actually here to talk about. Dangerous schism. With this kind of new traditionalist movement in the church. Let's be clear, overview of all of these podcasts. The liturgical preference is not a problem. It's somehow, there's a sociological pitfall and a spiritual pitfall that grows up around this liturgical preference. So there's plenty of great people with this. If you yourself have this preference, we have said nothing to condemn the preference. We actually think that the church is moving to a little bit more tradition, probably not all the way to a Latin Mass, but that's definitely happening.
Yeah, and the pitfalls we're talking about are not just applied to people with this certain liturgical preference.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can have all these problems without even preferring a more traditional liturgy.
Right. And we're talking about this, I feel like when you kind of point out some of the pitfalls that tend to exist in kind of conservative Catholic circles, people want to say like, well, not everyone is like that, and it's like a vocal minority or whatever. And I think both you and I and everyone we talk to seems to associate this. It's just been our experience that these pitfalls like exist.
Yeah, I don't think it's a vocal minority. I think it's a significantly bigger problem than a small minority.
Yeah. And we know lots of lovely people that are
right. That's also true.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's outline this talk. So we're going to talk about the dangerous schism is real. Related to this, we're going to talk about pastoring as a constitutive part of the Catholic Church. We're going to talk about religious error as modeled in the New Testament by the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then we're going to talk about Jansenism, a very particular heresy in the past and some similarities it has with what's going on right now. So the dangerous schism is real. It's so obviously real because we already have had a schism on this issue. It's usually referred to as Lefebvrites or SSPX. Mm-hmm. If you talk to people within those groups, a lot of them will say, oh, we aren't not really schismed, blah, blah, blah. And they all have their own take on this. But fundamentally, they're not in union with the church, so they're schismed.
Yeah. Well, just talking about the Lefebvrites and I think other, kind of conservative ideas. One thing I've noticed is like that there seems to be like a fixed idea of like what is tradition, almost as if we need to like discover the true tradition or discover the true liturgy or discover the true, like that there's like a sort of thing that exists outside of like the human experience or something that's like set in stone by God. And I just think this is like a strange idea. And it's like what did Jesus like found the church to be, and it's like Jesus founded the church to be, like he instituted it among men, with, humans as leaders. And I saw this thing that Lefebvre said something like that they with, his followers, he and his followers with all their hearts and souls adhered to Catholic Rome, the guardian of the Catholic faith, to eternal Rome. And it's like, what does that mean? And I would contrast this to Pope Benedict talking about like the living river of tradition, that is like Christ among us today, and Christ pointing us towards the future. And
we should probably introduce that Bishop Lefebvre. Am I saying his name right?
Lefebvre, yeah, sure, Lefebvre, yeah.
He is usually credited with originating the schism after Vatican II. Mm-hmm. And that's why sometimes the people in SSPX are called the Lefebvrites. Mm-hmm. The followers of Bishop Lefebvre.
Yeah.
And what this idea of the spiritual Rome reminds me of is like some things you hear in the Protestant church where it's like, well, there's the corporal church and the spiritual church. And what they're really saying is the spiritual church is what matters and the institutional church doesn't. And it's this funny way that it's like a renewed, like dualistic heresy where it's like, no, I mean, the church is the corporal church and the spiritual church and they're one, with all its problems. It's also true that they're one. You can't be dicing them up, the same way you can't dice yourself up between your body and your spirit.
Right.
I think the energy here is coming from a confusion. By the way, when we keep saying tradition, part of the confusion there is there's something called sacred tradition, which actually is inerrant, and it is from the apostles and from that time. And it's just like those teachings and practices that come from the very beginning and founding of the church that aren't actually written in Scripture. That's what they typically call sacred tradition. Now, this other types of tradition, like how many candles you use at the Mass or anything like this, right? These are kind of a small t tradition that is much more a living type of thing, and appropriate to the time. And I think what's happening here is like in the Orthodox, there's been multiple kind of conservative schisms within the church. There's a Jansenism schism that we can talk about later. Mm-hmm. There's also multiple schisms that still exist from Vatican I. They all remind me of kind of the most famous Orthodox schism that I know of, which is the Old Calendar Schism. So the Orthodox Church wanted to change the calendar, and I'm not sure exactly why they wanted to do it, but like a whole lot of, quote, old believers and old calendar people schismed from the Orthodox Church when they changed some of the dates, of the festivals, right? And the argument they made, as far as I can tell, is if you don't defend our calendar, if you don't defend these dates, then you also will not defend the far more important traditions when people come to change them, And so it's kind of ridiculous at one level, but you see where their energy's coming from. Like, don't touch anything that is sacred, right? And I think that's part of the energy that you see here with this kind of traditionalist movement when it gets close to schism.
Yeah.
And I think that also explains why they're always pointing to the far, I don't know, you'd call it the far left or the far innovative side of the church to justify their existence. They're like, it's important for us to take this stance because look at those crazies, and it's like, well, you're making yourself crazy to try to get, to protest these other crazies. Both groups are wrong. There's no like real logical dependence there.
Right. Yeah.
All right. The other thing that I think is important to note here is that we're already seeing in the church schism light. Like we're seeing people separate within the church into groups that go to a traditional mass and people who just kind of go to whatever mass is being offered at their local parish. And this is very troubling. I've seen it in the sense that I've seen like spiritual directors who are of a Latin mass in union with the church, but celebrating the Latin mass, saying things like, I would never suggest someone join a religious order except one that only celebrates the Latin mass. And it's like you are building a separate structure within the structure at that point,
Yeah. And I see friends that have maybe some frustration with specifically with how the Latin mass stuff has been handled in the church, or frustrations with things that Pope Francis has said, for instance, or whatever. And I feel like they are waiting for the straw that will break the camel's back until they leave Rome, and go Byzantine or whatever. I've heard more than one person say this, but I have a specific friend. I would love to talk to you about it if you're listening to this. But yeah, and I just think you're gonna leave the Roman Church because of a mass, a liturgical preference, but you stayed with the church during all the sex abuse scandals. I don't even understand that.
I think you're completely correct. It's like a real condemnation of the church, right?
Yeah.
Like a tree by its fruits. If you actually believe the tree is producing more bad fruit than good fruit, that actually is a theological disproof of the holiness of the church. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not a theological argument. It's definitely a weighing of evidence. So I don't want to get that all confused. But this idea of style, switching a style or switching something that the church obviously has the power and authority to switch, being the thing that disproves the church, is absolutely crazy in comparison to being bothered by the sin of the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The second point is pastoring is a constitutive part of the church, which kind of should be obvious theologically from this idea of apostolic succession all the way from the apostles, and the idea of holy orders as a sacrament, that you're endowing certain people as pastors within the church. And I see a lot of Catholics, particularly within the Traditionalist movement, do this exercise where they look at all the possible pastors they could have, all the possible bishops they could have, and then they choose amongst that big universe of people the couple that seem to agree with them, right?
Yeah.
And fundamentally, that's not pastoring. That's just choosing a few people that you agree with. Pastoring is when someone leads you to an area that you would not have gone to yourself. It's the shepherd leading the sheep. And it's, which almost definitionally means they're leading you into a blind spot, into something you wouldn't have thought of doing, or something that you might even disagree with. Not obviously sin, but like something short of that. If you agreed with everything the pastor did, you are not being led anywhere. You're merely just like kind of, giving gold stars to the pastor for agreeing with you,
Like inherent in pastoring is that you're being pastored by a person who has their faults and their beliefs and their own blind spots, and that we can still, and that's the model, is that we are still pastored by those people,
It's also, there's a certain sense in which having a plan is better than having no plan. Like if at Simple House we are planning out an event or something, I would rather have a plan that I don't think's great and actually have people on the same page trying to execute it than have no plan going into the event, Yeah. And so it's kind of like, this is trying to get into the idea of the office and the authority within the office, right? It's like, you may be a Republican or a Democrat. You may donate to your political party. You may campaign for them, right? But when the Republicans and Democrats go to Washington and create the new tax bill, you're going to pay those taxes.
Yeah.
Was it the Democrats' tax bill or the Republicans' tax bill? It kind of doesn't matter. At that point, it's the tax bill,
Yeah. There is a seminarian that was at a Simple House briefly, and we had to ask him to leave, but he was from a liberal diocese, and I do think there were a lot of problems in that diocese. But he had sort of gotten through the seminary by going under the radar of these people, like he had been sort of trying to play the game to not have his very conservative views noticed because he needed to be a priest, and he was crazy. It was not safe or okay or to have him around ministry people. And when I called him to tell him he couldn't come back, he was like, okay, but you don't need to call my formators. I was like, oh, we do.
That's what's interesting, because I've seen this both on a conservative and on a liberal side, and it's troubling both ways, right? Formation is supposed to be formation. Formation's not something that you try to escape and dodge. And is there bad formation? Yes, there is. Right. Yeah. But whenever I hear a young person going into a religious order or going into a seminary setting, and they're like, I just have to survive my formation and then I can be who I really want to be afterwards. Yeah. That's not an uncommon thing to hear. And that's the opposite of what religious formation is supposed to be. There's no Saint Benedict who's going to bless that attitude. Yeah, you know what I mean? Right, There's no, Saint Teresa of Avila is not going to say that's a good way to go about your formation, no matter what the situation was. She came from a pretty rough order herself, Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the next one here. I also, by the way, one more thing about the office. I've kind of often thought about it like feudalism or even being in the Army today. It's if you're in the U.S. Army, you're not going to 100% agree with every war or engagement the U.S. Army takes on, but it's still your job to go, right? And I think of that as I kind of think the church is a little bit, maybe feudalism's more modeled off the church than the church is modeled off feudalism. But there's a sense in which we have a lot of independence, but at the end of the day, our bishop is still our bishop. Mm-hmm. At Simple House, we have something called the bishop's veto, where we're not looking for the bishop to tell us what to do, but we let him definitely say what not to do. Yeah. If he tells us to knock something off or to quit doing this. And I also feel that way as a pastor's veto also. If you're in a parish area and that pastor doesn't want you there, we're not going to be there. Doesn't matter if I agree with that pastor or not. I want to be obedient to that pastor there. Yeah. And I think that's just part of the duty of that office and the duty of us as in observing the importance of it.
This isn't to say that you can't correct a pastor or a bishop or something, right? Obviously there's a time for that, but
there is a time, but it's kind of a rare time.
Yeah, I agree. It's a rare time. But I also think what we're talking about actually is just evading the pastor altogether and not engaging with the pastor.
Right. And I'll often hear people give examples of St. Catherine of Siena, correcting the Pope. But the way she did that and the rareness of that, it wasn't like she was campaigning publicly against the Pope.
Yeah.
That's what you see now. Catherine of Siena whispered in the Pope's ear a correction. It's just kind of a different way she had about her that she doesn't excuse some of the behavior we see now. In the New Testament, going on to the next point, there's kind of two different groups of Jews that play the biggest role. One is the Sadducees and one is the Pharisees. And these different groups are kind of opposites from one another. The Sadducees are the people who went to Rome, got political power on their side, had control of the temple, and they were kind of like compromisers with the world. If you read Maccabees in the Bible, there's this idea that like a gymnasium came to Jerusalem, like a Greek-style school, and some Jews learned Greek and went to the gymnasium, and other Jews were like, that's not Jewish, we're not going, right? So the Sadducees would be the ones who engaged the gymnasium, the ones
Gymnasium.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be embarrassed about that. All right, gymnasium. I thought you had to say it fancy if it was I think I always heard it in German class.
There's a long tradition at a Simple House of making fun of the way you pronounce certain words. So
okay,
maybe this is.
That'll be a new one though, because I don't think I use that word much. Gymnasium. That's the way I say it about an American gym. For some reason, when I talk about the ancient Greek, I have to say it fancy. Gymnasium.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll be the person that's.
Yeah,
wrong
you stand
here.
corrected, Laura. All right. Well, they're the ones who compromise with the world. You see that in the church in every age. There's certain people who want the church to be very agreeable to the world, who always want the church to fit the world, not to challenge the world, not to have that harder edge, right? But then there's this other group, which are represented by the Pharisees. They're the ones who are observing the law very strictly. They're the originators of the synagogues. They're the ones who are praying on the street corners that Jesus condemns. Jesus goes to their house and eats, and they're like, don't you know about this woman who is touching you and how fallen she is? They're kind of a very much more judgmental sect. They're the sect that we usually think of the Sadducees as the ones who don't believe in eternal life, and the Pharisees the ones who do. It's more complicated than that. The Pharisees are the ones who are much more into strictures. Like if you think about how St. Paul describes himself, he describes himself as a good Pharisee who honored every letter of the law, And this is interesting because Jesus alienates both groups. Both groups who are inherent enemies high-five each other at the crucifixion of Jesus. They're like, we did it. Boom. He was a problem for all of us. Yes. And religious error, I think, often goes one of these two paths. I don't know that it's always right to think of religious error as a mere theological mistake. It's almost like an attitudinal mistake.
Yeah, or mentality
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when the new traditionalist movement is getting off track, it's kind of getting off track in this pharisaical way, which kind of goes into an elitism.
I remember in the early days of a Simple House kind of having some of our discussions kind of arguing like what's worse, like truth without love or love without truth, and I sort of see that as being, what's worse, Sadducee or Pharisee, and in a way it's kind of like a stupid argument, right? Like there's like a Alice von Hildebrand quote in our manual about how like Christians think of truth and love as sort of like being one, and
love without truth is not said very much. Like you're supposed to say the truth with love. That's a much more common saying than you need to have love with truth, right? And you're right. They're both the same, right?
Yeah.
Chesterton has a quote on this too. He says something like, they have a truth and their truth lacks all pity, and these other people have a pity and their pity lacks all truth.
Yeah.
That's kind of saying the same thing, where pity's being used instead of love. And both are very bad.
Yeah, I do remember, though, there's like an Eberhard Arnold quote, who's not Catholic. He's founded the Bruderhof. That's truth without love kills, and love without truth lies. And I always had that sort of ringing in my ears. And I don't know, there's always something that seemed worse to me. And again, this is the argument that I think is unimportant. Don't do either. But that like the person who is like saying they stand for the church and Jesus 100%, then being kind of harsh, with people and lacking mercy is somehow, I don't know. And I do know that there's times that we've, sort of let ministry get off track by not being forward enough with like, trying to be loving of the person and not being forward enough with some of the hard teachings. But I feel like in those cases, the ministry maybe has like gotten off track a little bit. But compared to, I think there's times we've ended or nearly ended ministry by being too harsh,
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's, what I would like to see is for us never to make a mistake. But if you're going to make mistakes, let's make them both directions and not be always erring towards like too much empathy or always erring towards too, what would you say? Too harsh a truth or too much kind of love without truth. But let's kind of go from there over to Jansenism, and I think we need to talk a little bit about Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Yeah.
So Balthasar, for some reason, has become kind of
lightning rod.
A lightning rod. That's the best way. I was going to say, yeah. And it's all about one of his books. His work is voluminous, but there's one book that in English is called Dare We Hope All Men Be Saved. And it's one of his only books I've actually read. And I've been kind of upset with the way there's a lot of people trying to defend Balthasar because people really find that title, Dare We Hope All Men Be Saved, to be an alienating title. Mm-hmm. And I've heard a lot of defenders of him come forward. Even Bishop Barron and Larry Chapp did a podcast talking about this a little bit. And I feel like his defenders, even though I think Larry Chapp and Bishop Barron are great, I don't think his defenders are doing him justice. I think that's a pretty radical book. Mm-hmm. And I think it was meant to be radical at some level. And I think it kind of comes down to this, that if you're going to be a missionary in particular, but maybe everyone, even just with your own faith life, you kind of have an opinion about God's mercy, and it better not be a hard and fast opinion because we're not really qualified to quantify God's mercy. But there's this idea of like, what does salvation look like? It's got to be not zero. I think that's a firm teaching, right? There's got to be at least one person saved, or maybe two, maybe a plurality. But then there's a spectrum all the way towards everyone saved. And somewhere in there, you're going to think, man, I think it must be kind of like this, And it's really above your pay grade to know exactly, but you can't help but have an opinion about it. And what this book does is it says that there's actually no firm teaching that not everyone is saved. And if you've got a problem with that, you can argue with von Balthasar, but that actually is the argument of the book. And essentially the argument goes along the lines of, he shows that you are compelled to hope that all are saved. Not only, regardless of what your opinion is on salvation, you better hope that all people are saved. And there's something wrong with you if you don't hope. And God asks you to hope for nothing that is impossible. Right? And therefore it is possible. Right?
Yeah. So not is the case or isn't the case, just talking about possibility.
Right. Like whatever your gut tells you is right, is important, but you should hope that God even saves more people and is more generous in his salvation than what your gut says.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes into the Jansenism heresy. Let me step back and just say the reason why I found out about Jansenism is because St. Alphonsus is kind of my patron saint, and one of the patron saints of Simple House. And St. Alphonsus is credited with kind of being the great fighter of the Jansenist error. Mm-hmm. So this would have been a heresy taking place in the 1700s that led to a schism that exists all the way to today. There's still separated churches on this Jansenist schism. Yeah. But when St. Alphonsus was writing, St. Alphonsus also struggled with scrupulosity and worrying about God's judgment a lot. But his motto was plentiful redemption, So things that were happening around then was people would go to confession and not get forgiven. Like if you can imagine.
That's what the Jansenists thought.
Yeah. The Jansenists, as it infected people, it was like a theology where a priest would like take people into confession. They'd confess and he'd be like, I'm not sure you're sorry. I'm not sure that you're really not going to do this again. I'm not really sure that you've got enough resolve to be forgiven. So come back in 2 months, and if you haven't done this sin again, then come back and, we'll talk and maybe I'll forgive you at that confession. That was starting to happen. Another thing that was happening was very few people were taking communion because no one was worthy enough to take communion. And there was also a thing in the sexual morality where the only reason for sexual intercourse was procreation, unitive purpose, the idea of like NFP, or the idea that even people who are infertile could have sexual intercourse, was becoming seen as sin, too risky. And it was also accompanied with an opinion that there was going to be a very limited salvation, that the only people who were going to be saved were kind of like the super soldiers of the church, like the spiritual elite who had worked tremendously hard in self-denial and things.
Well, yeah, and who God had chosen to give a special grace to.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Blaise Pascal is the most famous Jansenist, and many things he said are good. But all of this, what's kind of interesting is you can actually go look up the theological condemnation of Jansenism. And it's the first heresy I've ever read where the theological justification of the condemnation just wasn't very powerful. Like, it seemed to be much more like a wrong-headed elitism than an actual theological error. And it made me wonder if all heresy doesn't end up that way. Like, even if you go back in time and look at like a major heresy, like the Arian heresy, which has a real theological point to it, makes me wonder if those people were just being assholes. Because I think that's what the Jansenists were doing. It was just kind of like an air of just being jerks. Yeah. Which is the ultimate error. It shows a condition of your soul, Yes. Like, you can probably go to the final judgment and have a theological error, and God will be like, hey, you were wrong on this point of speculative theology. And you'd be like, oh, okay. And he'd be like, come on in, right? But if you come to the final judgment and you're a complete jerk, you're going to have a much bigger problem.
Yeah. Yeah, but the problem before God won't have been the theological problem. It would have been the feud. Right.
Yeah. And it's not that truth isn't truth. It's just there's a sense in which these theological problems create spiritual problems, and maybe the spiritual problem was created first, then they came up with a theological quibble, Yeah. So I think there's a corollary here that there's kind of a spiritual elitism happening in the church with the traditionalist movement sometimes. And it's part of this kind of like schism light. Like, we're the ones who are doing it the right way. We're the like real church militant. The word church militant, or the old, like, there used to be a radical newspaper called The Wanderer, and it kind of seemed to be like this idea that there's this remnant of true Catholics out there, and everybody else is, everyone in that corporal church, mostly heretics, or really, not good enough in some sense, And I think I'm bringing this up because I think this is a real heresy, even though it's not really being built on a tremendous, like, great theological error. It's almost like a theological preference that ran away and became a theological error due to like a bunch of bad things that grew up with it.
Yeah. The thing that I think is like kind of sad about like the sort of Jansenistic view is just the limited view of God's mercy, and
right. You never want to be the person who is insulting God's mercy or God's love.
Yeah.
Like, God's love is so shocking that when Jesus walked the earth, it blew the established religion away. God's love and God's mercy, right? And he said, call God Abba Father, or Abba Daddy, basically Daddy. That was disturbing to the established religion of the day, right? Yeah. Particularly to the Pharisees. So you never want to be the guy who's downplaying God's love and mercy. At the same time, I'm not saying that we're, cool, everything goes because God has endless love and mercy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like an example, my friend's father died a few years ago. He had left the Catholic Church for reasons I know not. I wish he hadn't, I think there's like a sadness in that, people leaving the church, and I wish all our Christians were in the fold, all our Christian brothers were in the fold. He left the church
not to become an atheist or an agnostic.
Right. He left the church, joined a different church community, and lived decades as an upright man, as an example of a Christian man that was doing everything to follow Jesus with all his heart, and everyone that knew him saw him as this. And his one of his sons was greatly distressed by him leaving the Catholic Church, and sort of aggressive about this with the family all the time. And when he died, he didn't go to his father's funeral because it wasn't in a Catholic church, and it was like the saddest thing, And I don't know, like, I can't say what is happening or not happening here, but it's pretty easy to imagine that, like, God's mercy and might extend to a person that tried to follow him with everything he had, even though he left the church. I don't know where.
There's kind of two stories there. There's like the story of, like, it's way above our pay grade to judge anyone's salvation. So I like to refrain from that unless you're just sure there. Every once in a while you meet somebody. It's like when John Paul II died, I just wasn't that sad. I was like, this guy was awesome. He was clearly suffering, and he is now, a hero in heaven. I mean, it just didn't feel like a sad moment to me at all.
Yeah.
But overall, don't judge people's eternal fate.
Yeah.
But I think the other story is the son not going to the funeral.
Right.
Right. Like, there's a spiritual attitude there that's dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there was an idea that he ought not go, that he was doing the right thing by not going to this funeral. And there's no teaching that says you shouldn't go to the funeral of your late father who left the Catholic Church, and there's no teaching about that. And there's no Christian idea that I can think of that would even suggest that,
like he thought his father was an apostate, and therefore he had to, like, be dead to him or something like this. Right. Which is horrible. Yeah. Yeah. I get, maybe we're putting too many words in that guy's mouth, but it is, you see troubling stuff like that when things get too kind of spiritually rigid or elitist.
Yeah, it was related to, like, a rigidity. Yeah. And sort of, very rigorous moral view of the world. I don't know. But
yeah, well, maybe we can end this up with, I knew a religious who once warned me. She said, you have to worry when you become so Catholic, you become Protestant. Yeah. It's kind of the classic, you became more Catholic than the Pope.
Yeah. Yeah.
That needs to raise an alarm bell. So if you feel yourself going down that road, stop it. And if you see that dynamic in your little community of friends, fight it. And it's a fight. It's keeping the church together and away from this type of schism and out of a heresy. Mm-hmm. So, everybody, God bless you. If you're part of the Traditionalist Movement and that's what you're about, I hope you found these podcasts helpful. If you're a part of it or not part of it. So I hope you know it's coming from a good place. So God bless. All right. See you soon, Laura. All right. Bye.